opening ceremony, and the seminar aims to focus on the problem Guyana faces in relation to domestic violence. And as we know, domestic violence is described as family violence, and it is defined as acts or omissions or commission resulting in physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, or other forms of maltreatment that hampers individual healthy development. It is that type of behavior that causes one partner in a relationship to be afraid of the other. Through the use of power that this fear gives, the abusive partner controls the behavior of the other. And so domestic violence can take the form of physical, sexual, or psychological abuse, forced social isolation, or even economic deprivation.
Mr. Guthrie has alluded to the circumstances leading up to this event, but I would perhaps, if you would indulge me, provide just a wee bit more detail. In September of last year, His Honor Justice Brassington Reynolds and I attended the Commonwealth Magistrates and Judges Conference in Wellington, New Zealand. On the sidelines of that conference, I met Ms. Catalina Saparu, the Director of the Rule of Law Division of the Commonwealth Secretariat in London. And in that engagement with her, I inquired whether the Commonwealth Secretariat would be willing to support the Supreme Court of Guyana in hosting a conference on domestic violence in the country. I didn't think that there was a moment's hesitation, and Ms. Sapalu readily agreed. Within an hour, Mr. Mark Guthrie, who was also in Wellington, sought me out to advise that we needed to start planning very early for this event. So here we are today. Some time ago, with the support of UN Women, and latterly with the Commonwealth Secretariat, we had similar conferences here in Georgetown. The main target groups for those events were magistrates and police officers and prosecutors and welfare officers. My initial thoughts about this conference were that we should focus on magistrates. The reason being that since the last conference, we have lost, for various reasons, several members of the magistracy who have benefited from the initial exposure. But more so, I was becoming increasingly alarmed at the high incidence of domestic violence in our country, and the viciousness and the gruesome brutality associated with such occurrences, which were reported in the media. When I read in the local newspapers words such as bludgeon and batter used in reports on domestic violence, I am forced to the conclusion that our menfolk in particular are going berserk. So, when I indicated to you that my focus was initially on the target group of magistrates, it was because I hold strongly to the view that magistrates should be equipped to deal justly and appropriately with domestic violence matters, and that engagements such as the present will undoubtedly serve to equip them in that regard. But then I had a change of focus. Newspaper reports of comments made by the Minister of Public Health and the Minister of Social Protection brought home to me that these key agencies of the government, by the public statements of their respective ministers, were demonstrating an awareness of and concern about the problem of domestic violence in Guyana, and expression and intention to deal with it. The comments of Ministers Lawrence and Norton spawned the idea of a broader focus for this conference. When I contacted them, both ministers were very receptive to my approach, and both sent representatives to meet with me in the planning stages of this conference. I well recall that engagement. Those representatives of the Ministries of Public Health and Social Protection made valuable contributions. In particular, a representative of the Ministry of Social Protection pointed out to me that societal response tended to almost wholly blame men for domestic violence and ignored the reality that a significant number of men in our country were victims of domestic violence. Well, I found support for that contention in the newspapers. The Culture News last year published a letter with the caption, quote, "An alarming number of men endure both physical and psychological abuse," end quote. The writer advanced reasons for the underreporting of male domestic violence victims as being attributed to social cultural stereotypes and the fear of being judged negatively by others and of having their masculinity questioned. And I'm sure that all of you who have your origins in Guyana know that when a man is being thumped by his wife, he's a victim of what we call locally tantalized. And it impacts on the ready willingness of men to report the incidents of domestic violence. The writer of the letter related an incident of a young male Guyanese going to a police outpost to make a report of his domestic violence experience. As the reporter, according to the letter writer, as the reporter related the facts to the police officer, the latter beckoned to his colleague in the police station, saying, "Come, listen to this." In December last year also, the Guyana Chronicle reported Health and Shelter Director Margaret Koshis as saying that a significant number of battered men in Guyana were seeking the assistance of Health and Shelter in relation to domestic violence problems. On the occasion of the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, the Honourable Minister of Social Protection, Ms. Walda Lawrence, was reported in the press as saying that, quote, "fighting domestic abuse was an uphill task," end quote. True as this reality may be, the benefit of educating our people, young, middle-aged, and old, would undoubtedly yield positive results in our efforts to deal with domestic violence as a national problem. It was therefore in this context my great delight to read in the Culture News last year that students from Region 3 were exposed to a gender-based violence seminar. The report explained that the seminar was organized because of a recognition of the need to raise an awareness of domestic violence in the community, impacted the learning capacity of the students, among other negatives. The aim of the seminar was to educate the students so that they became agents of change, not only at school, but in their homes and in their wider communities. The education of the young in our society must be seen as a key step. The Region 3 initiative should be extended across the country, and that is my polite suggestion. The cost of domestic violence to children is cumulative over time. They experience emotional disturbance from domestic violence in the home, which is oftentimes reenacted in adolescence and in adulthood. Domestic violence is not a phenomenon to be treated lightly. It leads to the breakup of families and ultimately to some societal destabilization. It engenders a ripple effect. I have alluded to the negative impact on the mental health and well-being of children and their emotional stability. Its impact is also felt as a cost to the health and social services. It affects employment output and contributes to homelessness for men. The group UN Women contend that in relation to domestic violence, prevention strategies should be holistic, with multiple interventions undertaken in parallel in order to have long-lasting and permanent effects. Many sectors, actors, and stakeholders need to be engaged. More evidence is emerging on what interventions work to prevent violence, from community mobilization to changing social norms, to comprehensive school interventions targeting staff and pupils, to economic empowerment and income supplements, coupled with gender equality training. I believe that through this conference, the Supreme Court, in collaboration with the Commonwealth Secretariat and the Commonwealth Magistrates and Judges Association, is contributing to the recommendations of UN Women. This conference is a shift away from the conventional role of the court of adjudicatory control of domestic violence and the punishment of offenders to one of promoting gain through education. An interesting agenda has been put together, and I thank Mr. Mark Guthrie of the Commonwealth Secretariat and District Judge Shamin Qureshi of England for their efforts in putting this program together. I would also like to express my gratitude to Her Honor Chief Justice Margaret Ramsay Hale, Chief Justice of the Turks and Caicos Islands, Dr. Meena Shivdas, Dr. Diane Douglas, Magistrate Kirsty Ann Gunn of the Cayman Islands, Detective Sergeant Michelle Miller of the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service, and our own Karen D'Souza for their ready willingness to participate in this seminar and to address the various topics reflected in the two-day agenda. I have been remiss in failing to acknowledge the presence of the Commissioner of Police with us. I apologize, and I do so now. I take the opportunity to also thank Their Excellencies of the Diplomatic Corps, judges of the Supreme Court, Chief Magistrate and members of the magistracy, members of the bar, religious leaders and representatives of non-governmental organizations for taking the time to attend this event, which marks the opening of this important engagement. I would also like, on behalf of the Supreme Court, to express my deep appreciation and thanks to His Excellency President David Granger for being here with us this morning and for his ready agreement to speak to us today. As my colleague Chief Justice Cummings Edwards told you, the presence of His Excellency here this morning marks an indication that domestic violence is a matter of grave concern for him and his government. In closing, I refer once again to UN Women. Violence is not inevitable. It can be prevented. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Please be seated. Madam Chairperson, Chief Justice John Cummings, thank you for your introduction. Honorable Chancellor of the Judiciary, Justice Carl Singh, Minister of Social Protection, Mrs. Walter Lawrence, Chief Justice of the Turks and Caicos Islands, Justice Margaret Ramsey Hill, Legal Advisor of the Commonwealth Secretariat, Mr. Mark Guthrie, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Commissioner of Police, Mr. Silal Prasad, members of the Commonwealth Magistrates and Judges Association, members of the Judiciary, members of civil society, representatives of the non-governmental organizations here, members of the media, invitees. I'd like to thank the Chancellor for his kind invitation to be here this morning and to give me an opportunity to address you on some matters which are of concern to me. And basically the question I ask is, where does violence come from? Guyanese, a generation ago, may still have regarded domestic violence as a private matter. A man hitting his wife was considered a family affair. A parent or teacher whipping a child, what we call giving licks, was a conventional, even commendable form of correction. In fact, some parents may even recommend the schoolmaster to administer some licks. School fights were considered a regular part of the curriculum and dismissed with the comment that boys will be boys. Every day interpersonal violence, intimate partner violence, and other forms of domestic violence today, however, are far from normal, far from acceptable. These incidents have degenerated into an epidemic. The most deadly in this country have been characterized by arson, sometimes with the family still inside the house. Execution murders, massacres, murder-suicides, rape murders, mutilation and torture, even within families, within households, and within villages. These constitute the most vicious, the most virulent, and the most prevalent crimes of violence in Guyana today. Guyanese are experiencing the secondary impact of surviving in homes, of attending schools, and of growing up in communities where criminal violence persists or was recently prevalent. Televised and other media images of policemen shooting to death an unarmed, wanted man with his hands in the air. Corpses of suspects dragged through yards and thrown into trucks or boats. carcasses floating in canals or washed up on the foreshore. And in the more gruesome news media, the bleeding bodies of beheaded men have been impossible to avoid. Memories of murder and violence are difficult to erase. Buildings in some villages are still marked with bullet holes as perpetual reminders. Children have become orphans. Such violence inevitably migrated from the street into the home. The Guyana Police Force reported that during the 3,651 days of the decade from 2005 to 2014, it received 39,566 reports of domestic violence. So you can work it out, over 10 reports per day, Sundays included. In this country, the Troubles is the name given to the decade, roughly between 2000 and 2009, that witnessed this country's most intense and sustained wave of criminal violence since independence. There were over 1,400 murders during that decade, more than any other similar period in the modern history of Guyana. The previous administration never bothered to account to this nation for the hundreds of lives lost in criminal violence. It refused to conduct inquests into the assassination of its own Minister of Agriculture, Dr. Bonintention, of the assassination of the head of the police force's target special squad on the Linden-Soesdijk Highway, of the assassination of the deputy head of the Customs Narcotics Unit in Buxton, and of the attempted assassination of the Director of Public Prosecution in Kitty. It refused to conduct inquiries into the massacres which occurred at Agricola, Baggetstown, Eccles, Bartica, Border, Campbellville, Kitty, Lamahawk Gardens, Lindo Creek, Lusignan, and elsewhere. A generation of Guyanese, a generation which was an unwilling witness to criminal violence, has now grown up. The agony, anger, and alienation caused by violence against citizens, especially against the innocent, against the young, still simmer. The crimes have not been explained, and the memories have not been erased. Many are suffering in their bedrooms and schoolyards from the aftershock of the secondary impact of the years of criminal violence that they witnessed on the streets and that they read and saw in the media. The scars of the Troubles are still visible. Some communities, such as Bartica, Buxton, and Kingston, have become so unsettled by the violence that they erected monuments to the victims. The Troubles, no doubt, were the consequence of a high level of condonation of, or complicity with the rise of drug cartels and the importation of illegal narcotics and weapons. These crimes brought an unprecedented wave of criminal violence into the country during the first decade of the century. The consequence of this narco trade, particularly, has been a bloody battle to extend drug empires and to eliminate anyone who resisted them. The chairman of the Central Intelligence Committee, who during that period was also head of the Presidential Secretariat, described the criminal violence which was raging in the early days of this century as, and I quote, drug gang warfare. He invented the expression, and I quote, phantom force. to describe the gangs responsible for the perpetration of executions and murders. The force, of course, was no phantom, it was real. Any mystery about its origins and operations evaporated in October 2003 when a repentant gangster made the startling decision to confess his transgression and to expose the Phantom Force's link to a prominent government minister. A commission of inquiry was established to investigate whether the Minister of Home Affairs was implicated in, and I quote, promoting, directing, or otherwise engaged in activities which involved the extrajudicial killing of persons, end of quote. That's from the terms of reference of the Commission of Inquiry. Before the would-be testifier could testify, however, he was shot dead in his bed, sadly, on the night of the 24th of June, 8 days before the Commission was sworn in on the 2nd of July, 2004. Ladies and gentlemen, it would have been impossible for any society to have survived the troubles which Guyana endured without suffering the after effects, the secondary impact. The bandits, the Phantom Force, and the rogue policemen caused many deaths. The violence perpetrated by rogue policemen under the pretext of conducting investigations, when in fact it was only intimidation, has left permanent scars. The arbitrary arrests, unwarranted detentions, deliberate shootings, torture, deaths in custody, and sham inquiries have had a cumulative, corrosive, secondary impact on our society today. Many persons fail to comprehend how violent the drug war had become. Many fail to fathom the repercussions of the prolonged violence which claimed the lives of an unprecedented and still undetermined number of policemen and young people. Opposition members of the National Assembly compiled a dossier in support of an independent legal interrogation of grave human rights abuses in Guyana on state-sponsored violence and other crimes. They too try to comprehend the enormity of this terrible human tragedy. Ladies and gentlemen, the eradication of domestic violence has to start with an investigation into causation. It matters little how many laws are enacted. The core problem will not be solved unless the core causes of domestic violence in Guyana are addressed. Guyana indeed has promulgated a raft of laws aimed at deterring domestic violence, at punishing its perpetrators, at protecting victims and potential victims. These laws, as you shall hear over the next 2 days, include the Domestic Violence Act, the Sexual Offences Act, the Prevention of Crimes Act, the Evidence Act, and the Criminal Procedures Act, and I'm sure there are many other acts that you can hear about. But the law has limitations. The law cannot deal with the impact of violence on society. The law cannot rebuild shattered lives and broken homes. The law, unfortunately, does not address the causes of violence. Laws can punish. They cannot, without an examination of the causes of the crimes, eradicate the scourge of criminal violence and its secondary outcome, domestic violence. Legislation is essential, but explanations are also needed. Domestic violence and the culture of violence are byproducts of the emergence through time of unequal relations in society and the state. I recall, and I quote, "Domestic violence should not be seen or defined as simply a set of abusive behavior. At the root of domestic violence is the real perceived inequality and subordination, particularly of women and children, which extends beyond the individual or family to the wider society. Any campaign to eradicate domestic violence, therefore, must aim at nothing less than changing the deep-seated cultural attitudes and behavior which have been learned, especially the attitude to equality. Violence in the home cannot be separated from violence in society and violence in the state. The primary cause of domestic violence is not, as is commonly believed, in my view, drunkenness, drug abuse, or everyday domestic disputes. These factors may foster domestic violence, but I do not believe that they are the causes. Criminal violence is likely to be most prevalent in unequal societies. Domestic violence, similarly, is likely to flourish in unequal relationships in households. It is the result of a complex interplay of cultural, psychological, and social factors which create imbalances of power between parties in a relationship or parties in a state. This imbalance, which can lead to domination and abuse, is at the root of domestic violence. Violence, if I can paraphrase the Chancellor, violence is not a social necessity. It is a human invention aimed at generating and perpetuating domination of one person or one group by another. Guyana seeks to significantly reduce and eventually eradicate the infamy of domestic violence. This will require a sincere and serious approach to ensuring the equality and respect for women, girls, and other minorities. It will take time to undo decades of a culture of criminal violence. The removal of the inequalities, therefore, both in the home and in the state, is a prerequisite for happy homes and a gentle country. I thank you.